Well, good morning, everyone. And my name's Alex McDonald, and I'm from Live Oak Friends Meeting in Houston. And it's a delight to be with you all today in Austin. I guess one of the slight benefits of this year of COVID is that we've gotten used to doing this kind of Zoom connection. And in some ways, we've actually, I feel, gotten more connected at further distance. And so this is sort of one of the nice the silver lining on the cloud, if you will, of COVID. So thanks for having me. The topic of today's forum is conversations about Israel-Palestine. And what I'd like to do is to share with you why we need to have conversations on this subject with others, who we need to have them with, and how to make them productive. So those are my objectives for today. And what I'd like to do is start by just asking you all to put in the chat, and it may be a little harder for you all in the meeting house, but feel free to raise your hand in the meeting house to share if you'd like. What either experience you've had, just looking for just short phrases of problems you've had when you try to have conversations on this subject with others, or concerns you have or fears you have of having conversations on Israel-Palestine with others. So one I see here from Paul is that one concern he has is that no matter what opinion he expresses, he doesn't have enough background in the facts. He's concerned that he'll know less than somebody else and won't know how to respond, maybe. Is that fair, Paul?
I think that's fair.
Thank you. I see from Jim that the history is a very long one. Tobin says, the emotional temperature rises up to interfere with the ability to think through a response. Okay, so it gets very emotional. Critical comments about Israel are deemed anti-Semitic. Friend from Israel says it's better to just not talk about it. Mm. So these are great. Thank you all for sharing these. And so I'll do a little plug here for next week when I'll be doing our forum, if you will, at Live Oak Friends Meeting. And it's going to be about how the information we're getting in the U.S. has been suppressed. And one of the ways is this last comment. Friend from Israel says it's better to not just talk about it. And so, again, this is why I'm having this session today. I think it's important. So what I'd like to do, RF, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, I do. I don't really agree about news not getting out. I think it's a matter of what outlets they get out. For example, I was listening to to issues in Gaza, and one time I was listening to NPR, and they were interviewing the Israelis, and at the same time I was listening to Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Pacifica Radio, and they were interviewing Palestinians. So it's a matter of what outlets you're listening to. Happily, Palestinians today are getting their voice out, just like in many ways, like the Black Lives Matter movement. They're using social media to show things that are happening in real time. So I think that where it was more difficult, and I am saying this as a Palestinian American, where it was more difficult in the past to get our message out, you're not having that issue today.
So RF 9:20 next Sunday, I'll send you a link.
Sounds good.
Love to have the conversation. So getting back, let me get to today's, and I'm going to try to share my screen here, and let's see if I'm successful. All right. You all see my screen. Good deal. All right. So I just shared with you that these are the three objectives, and I'm going to add one other, let me see here if I can do this correctly. I'm going to add another thing, and I'm going to make it a lot. The comments that we shared earlier were that it's, you know, there's fear, there's concern, I'm not going to know the right answer, and so on. I'm going to also want to make them enjoyable, connecting and transformational conversations.
Mm.
So I'm going to set the bar really high, and we're going to go from there. So we've just done this. So let's start by how a lot of people think about this. And that is, a lot of people will say that, well, there's a sort of a Palestinian perspective, and then there's a Zionist perspective, okay? And so that the problem is, yes, there may be a little bit of overlap in these perspectives, but they're so different that it's hard to have a conversation. And that's what leads to a lot of the argument. But this is sort of the Zionist view, right? Since its inception, Israel has continuously been on the defensive. The land Israel controls was given exclusively to the Jews by God, the UN, or both. The Middle East conflict is because Arabs have hated the Jews, and Israel wants peace, and the Arabs are the aggressors. That's sort of the Zionist viewpoint, if you will, that blue circle that I shared, right? But if we drill down a little bit, you know, Israel controls land it took, you know, from Syria, from Jordan, from Egypt by force, and it still controls it today. So that defensive argument, and in fact, in 1948, as you all know, I from the history that you got last week from Hytham and such and RF, that you know, even the 48 was taken by force. So that defensive argument doesn't really work. In terms of the land Israel controls, if you look at the UN partition plan and Resolution 181, first of all, it was never implemented. And second of all, it did not give it exclusively to the Jews.
Exactly.
In the Middle East conflict, this whole hatred narrative that we hear isn't true because they've lived together for millennia. So it's really since the Balfour Declaration that we've had a lot of problems. And finally, the aggressors narrative is improper because the ethnic cleansing continues and the right of return is still being denied. I'm using language that I would not use to the general public because I'm assuming that you all are much more familiar with this subject based on both the meeting and your recent forum. So if there's any questions of the language I'm using, please stop me. But you see how there's really, this whole argument falls apart, and it falls apart with information that even the Zionists know. They may not have connected the dots, but even they know it. RF, I see your hand, but I've got very little time. Can I, if you don't mind, let's hold the question till the end. So the point is, the Israel story does not add up. And so the reality is we don't have two narratives. We have one narrative and we have an illusion of a narrative. And if we approach our conversations with that perspective, it will really change how comfortable we feel with it. So, and this perspective is huge, because currently people who are not there, to me, there are two kinds of Zionists. There are those who just believe it because it's the message they've heard all their lives, and then there are those who really know it's a myth and still promote it. Okay, but for those who are well-meaning and you know, they believe that they're supporting democracy by supporting Israel, that they're supporting the security of the Jews, that they're promoting the Judeo-Christian values and peace by supporting Israel and against Hamas and the terrorists and the hatred. But what they don't realize is actually it's backwards. By supporting Israel, they're fighting democracy because Palestinians don't have the right to vote and citizenship. They're fighting security because they're doing this oppression. and they're supporting terrorism. So it really flips it on its head. And if we can just make them aware of that, then that's where we can make progress. So this is just a table. Sorry, the format looks kind of weird today. But I call it the language of Israel. I've written 2 books on this, where I call it the Israel language. It's words that are English words, but they actually mean the opposite. So defensive in the language of Israel, it supports taking land by force, whereas in English, it's the opposite, okay? Democracy in English requires self-determination for people, but in this Israel language, it denies it. Return, and so on. Does that make sense? Okay, so the vocabulary is designed to hide the racism of the Zionist project and of Zionism as a whole. And if we can just shine a light on the language, then the people who are not trying to promote the Zionist agenda because malevolently, just the ones who are going along for the ride, then we can maybe get some change. Why do we care about this? I care about this because obviously people are dying and being oppressed. I care about it because the messaging is intentionally deceptive, and our Quaker testimony of integrity is compromised, and because the Zionism requires racism in the violation of human rights. This is against our testimony of peace and equality. And very importantly, when people ask me, why do I have so much energy on this project versus, Sudan versus South Sudan or the Uyghurs or whatever, the reason is because my government spends, the #1 foreign aid, the #1 vetoes in the Security Council, and our military is involved. So we are responsible for this one. All right. So who can change the situation for the Palestinians? This is the full list, but the reality is there's no incentive for the society in Israel or the politicians in Israel to change. In the US, politicians are clearly not leading the way, so it's up to us. The ball's in our court. And what do? We need to do it by conversations. And that's why I'm having this session today, because this is the power to change. It's within us. So we need to find, and we need to find people, not just the choir and preach to the choir, but we need to find people who are honest, not the ones who are trying to deceive, and people who oppose racism. If people are for racism, then there's nothing wrong with what's happening in Palestine, okay? But the conversations are what we need to do. So in terms of people to talk to, this is the landscape that I look at. There are those who intentionally deceive, which is the bottom line. I don't waste my time with them. I'm not going to convince somebody who's intentionally trying to deceive the U.S. public. But on the upper row, there are those that believe the myth, and there are Jewish Zionists, Christian Zionists, and other. The darkest green is my first target, the other. These are people who are for equality, for human rights, for freedom, and who oppose, our taxes and foreign aid to be used for against those values above that. So other, human rights organizations, people that through Amnesty International or, Human Rights Watch or Black Lives Matter, things of that nature, okay? The next shade is actually the Jewish Zionists. And the reason is, my experience is that I have a better time with conversations with Jewish Zionists, again, who are not intentionally deceiving, okay? Because a lot of them have been brought up with a very high sensitivity to anti-Jewish racism. And so they're very sensitive to, racism issues. And if one just holds up a mirror and shows them that they're supporting a racist regime or a racist concept, they get very sensitive about that. Unfortunately, I don't have the same level of confidence with Christian Zionists about their sensitivity to racism. And I don't want to stereotype any groups, but that's just my experience. So the darkest green is my first target. The slightly lighter green is the next, and then the lightest green is the following. All right, what do we do? Now these conversations, I don't think anybody has had an easy conversation on this subject with anybody. So the key is developing a relationship with people, because the goal is to have more than one conversation. So we don't want to be right and end the conversation, because that will end the relationship. So we need to develop the groundwork for the conversations. We need to use our curiosity to keep them engaged. And oftentimes, when I showed you that Venn diagram, the two circles at the beginning, it creates an us versus them kind of mentality. And that's often the mindset of people having conversations like this. And the mindset is, I've got to beat them. I got to be right in the argument. I got to convince them. And if you ask questions and try to understand their perspective, they think they were going to be winning. If we're doing all the talking, they're not going to like that. So the goal is, keep that in mind when you're having these conversations, okay? But so, and what we're going to do is use a technique to get them to, forcing them to explain their position. It's going to show them, we're going to be pointing out very delicately, but pointing out where we don't understand the logic of their argument and asking them to complete it. When I showed you those 4 bullets at the beginning and how they didn't make sense, we're going to be asking them questions like that. Now, it'll be a lot easier for you than trying to prove your point, because you're not telling them you know the answer. You're just asking them to explain their position. But by doing so, it's the only way they're going to unlearn their mythology. When, if I tell them it's blue and they tell me it's red, I'm never going to convince them. But if I say, I thought the sky was blue and this doesn't look at all like it, can you help me understand why it's so different? Then they start having to look in the mirror and they'll be realizing slowly that they're believing in a con. And that's only they can invalidate their myth. We can't. We can just help that happen. So we have to do a lot of listening. We have to ask them questions. And very importantly, we have to hold them to their story. Okay? And we need to be very selective with the facts that we bring to them. Because if we bring facts certain facts they already know, those are easy, we can bring them to them. Like, you say it was a land without people for a people without that land. Why is the second largest group of refugees in the world Palestinian then? How could it be a people without land when there are so many refugees? That's a type of question. They know that they're Palestinian refugees. All right. So can you all see this picture okay? And in the meeting house, you may not be able to, but this is a house of cards. And on each of these cards, I'll read them to you so you don't have to come up and kiss the screen. But the top of the card says Jewish state. And then below it, it says democracy, victims, peace, security, defensive, land of no people, promised land, equality, anti-Semitism. And underneath, so those are all, this whole support that the United States has for a Jewish state and for Israel is based on this mythology of all these words. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. They're the Jews are the victims from all these Arab aggressors. Israel has wanted peace. They need security from these terrorists. They're on the defensive, et cetera, right? These are all the stories that bring support from the United States to this. But on the bottom here are some other cards. It's a blockade. There's apartheid. There are settlements. There's occupation, refugees, and the right of return. And the reality is, if we can get these cards to be more visible, the occupation, how can it be a democracy if there's occupation? I don't understand that. The people who are occupied don't get to vote. How's that democracy? Then these other cards start falling down and the whole thing collapses. And so that's the goal of our conversation. It's not to shoot at it. It's a lot easier if we let them just show them the cards that are flat on the bottom and help them explain how the ones that are holding up this house of cards make sense when we know the ones on the bottom are true. Okay? So that's sort of the approach that I recommend that's worked for me. And so the real risk to Zionism is our conversations. And that's where our power is for justice, peace, equality. All right, here's my plug. This is my book. And I think Hytham told you about it last week. And this, basically in it, sorry, I don't know how much he told you about it. So I'll just make it quick. It goes through 18 of the popular expressions. I'll show you which ones they are. It tells you some very basic facts. Again, the goal is not to give them a lot of facts. The goal is to have them question and explain their position. And then I unpack each of those messages, identify the core issue, which usually relates to racism, okay? And then I had to do the Quaker thing. I had to provide queries. So there are queries that you can use then with your conversation partner to really discern what their real position is. Do they really stand for a segregated apartheid? Is that the values that they promote? Do they really think that, one of the people in the chat mentioned that, they're concerned about being called anti-Semitic. Help me understand how standing for equality is racist against anybody. Can you help, there's a query to discern. And so, anyway, so here are, I group them into 6 groups. The first one is where they're attacking you. The first one we've just talked about. That comment is so anti-Semitic. Why are you singling out Israel? This view is not balanced, it's pro-Palestinian. The second group is pressuring acceptance of a Jewish state. So do you believe Israel has the right to exist? I wish I could see all of y'all's faces, and maybe I don't know how to do this. But anyway, I hope some of these resonate with you. Have you all heard some of these before? The UN gave Jews Israel because of the Holocaust. God gave Jews the land. The third group is justifying Israeli actions. Doesn't Israel have the right to defend itself? The security fence or wall is needed to protect Israel. Group 4 is demonizing or criticizing Palestinian actions. like not all Palestinians are refugees. They claim demanding Palestinians' right of return is a ploy to end the Jewish state. I'm reading these for the people in the meeting house who may not be able to read this on the screen. Palestinians and other Arabs are taught to hate Jews. Does somebody want to read the other two groups? Tobin, you want to unmute and do that? Thanks.
Group 5, describing an alternative reality. There's no occupation. All of Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria are all part of Israel. Gaza is not under occupation. It is under Hamas control. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and Israel just wants peace. Group 6, claiming that Israel is like the United Nations. We should support the only democracy in the Middle East. We need to support Israel. They are like us. They have Judeo-Christian values.
Thank you. So again, I hope these resonate with you. I'll show you one example, just so you know how the book is laid out, and then we'll jump into Q&A. So that'll give us about 15 minutes, if that's good. So I picked this one. The view is not balanced. It's pro-Palestinian. I share different similar expressions. So here's one that says, this conversation needs to include more of the Israeli perspective. I've heard that. This perspective does not take into sufficient account Jewish history of persecution and the Holocaust. And so then I'll pull some related facts. Again, this is secondary, okay? But let me go into, then I unpack the language. Here, Steve, are you willing to read a little bit? If you don't mind, just to change the monotone Alex voice.
There's a lot of noise in the background in my house.
Okay. How about you, Jim?
Sure.
Thank you.
Unpacking the Israel language, the argument that your position is not balanced, that pro-equality is pro-Palestinian, has unspoken narratives and assumptions. They may include one or more of the assertions in the following list. You may have others that are not listed. Go through the list and highlight which ones resonate with you and your conversational partner. That balance is possible, especially in an unbalanced situation. That balance is appropriate in an unbalanced situation. That standing for equality is not balanced, since your conversation partner is calling it pro-Palestinian. And that your partner wants balance.
So then we have, that I highlight in a box like this, the core issues. You mind, Jim, continuing?
Sure.
Thanks.
Pro-equality is not pro-Palestinian, just as it is not pro-Jewish. Pro-equality is anti-racism. Zionists call anti-racism pro-Palestinian, which implies that pro-Israel requires racial discrimination. When they say this view is not balanced, it's pro-Palestinian, what they really mean is your position for equal rights is balanced, and that's a problem for Zionists.
Okay. So then I go into a recommended approach. And almost all of these, really the core issue is racism. And it's a framing that hides the racism. And so our job in these conversations is to shine a light on it and provide queries that make it really hard for them, the conversation partner, not to see it. So here I go in and I say, therefore, your response needs to be something that leads the conversation back to racism and to exposing Israel and your conversation's partner's support for Israel as supporting racism. Okay. So then I provide queries, as I mentioned earlier. So does somebody else want to, RF, do you want to read some?
Sure. If your view is that of equal rights for Jews and Palestinians is not balanced, then are you saying that balance is achievable only by violating human rights? What is a balanced perspective on violations of human rights and crimes against humanity? And with plenty of examples, are you suggesting that it's appropriate to use the Holocaust as a justification for racial discrimination, ethnic cleansing, violating human rights, war crimes, and crimes against humanity?
go ahead, if you don't mind continuing a little bit.
Sure. When other communities such as Saudi Arabia, China, etc., are criticized for violating human rights, you also ask for a balanced perspective of their oppression. When someone promotes or speaks well of Israel, you ask for a balancing position. If pro-equality is pro-Palestinian, then how can pro-Israel be anything other than anti-equality or pro-racism? When you say this perspective is not balanced because it does not put enough emphasis on the Israeli perspective, what specifically is missing? What is missing other than a rationalization for ethnic, aka Jewish, supremacy and discrimination?
So some of these are a little bit more sharp than others, and they depend on the audience and how close the relation. If this is the first conversation, you probably don't want to ask that last query. But you can, as you're developing a relationship, and you might only ask the first question in the last query as opposed to both of the questions. But this sort of leads you into putting the ball back in their court. And again, what I like about this approach is, and the reason I don't put a lot of historical background, I just provide some basic facts, is because, again, the whole approach that I'm recommending here is not one where we preach the truth to them. It's where we ask them to prove their story, because their story doesn't add up. Okay? So what I want you to remember from today is that we are the ones who have to change the situation by changing the narrative, because our politicians won't do it, and there's no incentive for Israel to change at this point. We've made it too easy for them to maintain the occupation. We need to build relationships with other Americans and to have these conversations. We need to ask clarifying questions that can bring out clearly the discrepancies in the Zionist story and highlight the incongruity. And then you can get a book that can help you with that. And I'd like to plant the seed of make a plan. Who are you going to talk with? And again, go back to that table. You remember that table with the different color greens? Who do you know in human rights work that you do? Who do you know in social justice efforts that you may be active in? Who are your Jewish friends who are not, maybe as knowledgeable? I am absolutely convinced. I'll tell you a little quick story, and then we're going to jump into Q&A. One of my son's roommates in college, and they actually knew each other from middle school, had his bar mitzvah. And we were on vacation together, and I asked him if they taught him anything about Palestinians for getting ready for his bar. He said, "Oh yeah." I said, "Like what?" He said, "Oh, there are a lot of them in Gaza." And I said, "Oh, okay. And what did they and how did they get there?" And he said, "Oh, Israel gave them that land." And it was so enlightening to me that, instead of them being refugees, the perspective, the narrative that had been spun to him was that Israel had given them land. No wonder they think that they're ungrateful. No wonder they think that they're terrorists. It's this whole story that they've been weaved, they've been snookered with. And so, I've heard story after story from my Jewish friends where they have totally been misled. And you can do research on the internet, and you'll find groups in Israel even who don't know what's going on. So anyway, with that, I'd like to open up to questions. RF, you had your hand up first, so you get first shot if you'd like, and then
Thank you.
Everybody else.
Okay, so gosh, so much I can comment, but I will keep it short. To me, the number one aspect of our conflict is identity. If we have a clarity on identity that we all belong in the same place, then that takes care of most issues. Two things with supremely deep respect that I have for you, sir, is that there were two things I disagreed with you about. One is when you said that Palestinians don't have the right to vote. Well, Palestinians who live in the occupied territories do not have the right to vote. I don't like when Israel likes to define who Palestinians are. To me, there are five groups: Palestinians who are Israeli citizens who have the right to vote but are in the underclass, Palestinian Jerusalemites who have a very complicated relationship with Israel, Palestinians under occupation, Palestinians who live in diaspora with citizenship in another country, and those who live in diaspora without citizenship. So we are that inclusive, because I don't like when anyone limits the definition of Palestinian. So similarly, I'm now making a huge point of saying that Palestinians are of 6 Abrahamic faith traditions: Baha'is, Samaritans, Druze, Muslims, Christian, Jews. It rhymes. And I see Jews all the time saying Samaritans are not Jews. They don't revere Jerusalem. They revere Nablus. Well, they fit into the Palestinian tent really well. And Baha'is have nowhere else to go but Haifa. So when I make big tent for Palestinians, it makes it a whole lot easier. You also, in the last couple slides, use the word racist. The problem with the word race is that it implies color. I know that's not what you mean, but in America, they think it means color. You put me up against an Ashkenazi Jew, you wouldn't know who is who. You put a Mizrahi, and a quote unquote Oriental Jew against a Palestinian Arab who is from the south of, say, Hebron, you wouldn't know who is who. I would rather, instead of saying racist, I would say xenophobic. Way back in the 80s, the Jewish communities were saying at the time, what is the biggest existential threat to Judaism? It's not Arabs, it's not Iran, it's not, terrorism, it's intermarriage. They're afraid of losing their existence because of intermarriage. And God forbid, or Lord forbid, that if Palestinians start marrying Israelis, and I have a step uncle and step aunt who is Palestinian and Jewish, that, oh my gosh, they're going to have children, and then they won't be full blood anymore. So I really do think of it as xenophobic. And finally, I love talking with Zionists Christian Zionists, because I love talking about the historic Christian community in Palestine. They're unaware that Christmas is a national holiday, huge national holiday in Palestine. Well, it's not in Israel. What does that say about Judeo-Christian ethics? And for more than that, our celebrated beer is Teiba beer, which is done by Christian Palestinians outside of Ramallah, which is, of course, a traditionally Christian city. So I will talk to anybody, but the big thing I like to do is I like to use Zionist terminology to bring out the aspirations of Palestinians. So I don't say that we want the right to return. We just want to make the right to rise up, to take in Aliyah, just like the Jews do. We don't want anything different. We want it to be the same way. And we do not, and I don't like to say that we are refugees. I like to say that we're in diaspora, because that's actually a more accurate statement. As many times as Palestinians have had to move on from country to country to country over the last 70 years, which actually included my father until he finally got to America. So that was a whole lot to throw at you. But I think that if we really focus on identity and say that we are not just limited to small little towns, but we are all over the world. We include Jews as Palestinians. We do not shut out anybody. Then we're saying that we are not against Jews, we're against privilege.
So thank you, RFU. One thing that you've pointed out, I think is very important for everybody, is the precision of language. And I should have said all Palestinians can't vote, as opposed to Palestinians can't vote. So because that's the issue, that not all of them can. It's kind of like we're saying, yes, the problem before the Civil War was not that no blacks couldn't vote. It's that all blacks couldn't vote. So that precision is very important. The reason I use the term racism is very important. It's a conscious choice. First of all, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination defines racial discrimination to include ethnicity, country of origin, and descent. So descent even includes, for example, the caste system in India. That's considered racism or racial discrimination. And the reason I think the term racism is important and we need to change the language that people use. I never use the term anti-Semitism because I don't know about RF and I want to give other people time as well. But I know a number of Palestinians who are, and Arabs who are offended when the term anti-Semitism is only meant to exclude Jews, you know, because they're a very small minority of the Semites. So I use anti-Jewish, and I use it in this presentation, racism. I call it anti-Jewish racism. So that's why I use the term racism. I think it's important. Any term with the use phobia, so I heard xenophobia, and y'all probably heard Islamophobia. I never use those terms because what's an anacrophobic person? Somebody who's scared of spiders, right? If I got the right word. Or claustrophobic person. It's somebody who's scared of enclosed spaces. Who's the victim of a phobia? It's the person on the wrong side, right? But if somebody is anti-arachnids, they're against spiders. And so somebody who's Islamophobic looks like the victim, whereas somebody who's anti-Muslim is the aggressor. And just hear the difference between saying Judeophobic and anti-Jewish, right? Islamophobic, anti-Muslim. And so I never use the phobic words for that. Again, importance of language. Does anybody else have any questions? I see we only have about 5 more minutes. Yes, Steve, please, you're muted.
It's not so much a question as a comment. And in the beginning, you emphasized that we have to give up on our politicians and government. And I don't want to overly disagree with you, but I completely disagree with you because Israel exists in its current state because they are a mini United States. Our racism, our commitment to dominate our neighbors, our disregard for internal communities, et cetera, that are so fundamental to our crypto-fascist capitalist structure depend upon having those kinds of similar countries around the world. And we will die for Israel almost. And so at some point, in addition to talking to friends and neighbors and other Quakers, we have to get our government to change.
I agree 100%, Steve. What I was trying to convey, and I apologize for not doing it more clearly, is that I think we have to do it from the bottom up as opposed to the top down.
I understand that, but whereas that was possible with South Africa, not possible here. It's, structurally, it's going to be the military, anyhow, it's much more difficult to work just from the bottom up. Here.
Let's do both. Any other questions? Anybody? Go ahead, Tobin. You're muted.
Yeah, there we go. The thought comes to me, I like the idea of the focus on explaining and asking for an understanding, because that does keep the focus with the person you're listening to. I do think it's important when entering these conversations to enter with and model the listening with the openness to change. Changing your understanding is as critical as changing theirs, because if you enter it with an agenda and a goal to somehow change them, that's going to be communicated rather quickly and people will defend against it. And so it is important with that focus for helping you understand their position. I think that's very, very strong. And you have to be willing to understand things that you might not have thought of and acknowledge it when you understand you've learned something new. That builds the trust, which supports the relationship, which you're hoping to understand. And I like the focus that you brought to it.
Absolutely. I mean, I would not have learned this, as I told you, the story of my son's friend and roommate, had I not had that approach. So yeah, I've learned a lot from having these conversations. Thank you, Toby. Any other questions, comments? The last couple of minutes.
This is Atif again, just about the comment of Israel and many United States. Israel has hegemony over the occupied territories, and the U.S. does not block off parts of their hegemony from other parts. So Puerto Ricans can, even though Puerto Ricans are citizens, even if they don't have full access to Congress, but they can travel anywhere they want. The only exception is American Samoa, where they are born stateless. That's the only place out of all of U.S. hegemony where people are born stateless. And so we are much better than Israel in not denying, or we are much better than Israel in allowing for movement and allowing for citizenship.
And RF brings up an important point too, because a lot of times I've had it where people say, yeah, but the U.S. has ethnically cleansed the Native Americans or things of that nature. And the differences are important. So when you take American Samoa, yes, I have a problem with it, but I'm willing to say they ought to have their citizenship. And the question is, are you willing to say that Palestinians ought to have citizenship? And that's one big difference. The other big difference with the Native Americans is, even though Native Americans were ethnically cleansed, today they have the right to vote, and they can move back to their native lands and buy a house there. Palestinians today, as Hytham told you last week, he can't move back to his town near Jenin where his folks have a house. And so the difference is, yes, that may have been true centuries ago, but it's not true today, whereas it is true today in Israel. With that, I see we're at 10:50. I want to honor your time. I really appreciate being with you all today. I will put in the chat the site where I've got another book too, which is really good for people who want to learn about the history and about the U.S. involvement. And it's really good for people, friends of yours who want to learn more. It totally unpacks the mythology. There are tons of books out there about the history from another perspective. This is about unpacking the mythology that we hear in our media. And I'll put in there also my email if anybody ever wants to have conversations on this. RF, you're welcome to as well. And again, I will welcome you all to next week's at Live Oak Friends meeting at 9:20, where I will be going over how the U.S. Public has, the information has been suppressed in multiple ways, through laws like the anti-BDS laws, through pressure on the media, through pressure in schools, curriculum, and so on. So I will put in, I will pass it on to Jim, the link for our meetings, if for anybody who's interested. Peace, y'all. It's great to be with you.